My toxic sister-in-law tried to kick me out of my own home, so I sold it and left. I'm a 32-year-old woman, and this story begins with the house I inherited from my grandmother. It's a stunning 2-story suburban home in a wonderful neighborhood, the kind of place with tree-lined streets, welcoming neighbors, and plenty of character. This house isn't just real estate. It's filled with memories. My grandmother lived there for decades, and everything about it reminds me of her. The house is in my name, completely paid off, and something I thought I'd never have to worry about until my sister-in-law moved in. I married Jason, my husband, 2 years ago after dating for 3 years. He's 34, and we've always had a solid relationship, at least at first. Jason is very close to his sister, Diana. She's 37, a carefree woman who avoids working and always has to have the final say. Diana is the type who insists she's just trying to help, while completely disregarding other people's opinions. Jason often brushed off her behavior, saying, "That's just how she is," which I didn't like but tolerated because it wasn't my issue back then. Things changed about a year ago. Diana's landlord increased her rent, and she couldn't afford to stay in her apartment. Jason suggested she temporarily move in with us until she found a more affordable place. I was reluctant. Having your sister-in-law over for dinner is one thing, but sharing your entire living space is another. However, I agreed under clear conditions. No redecorating, no altering the house rules, and she would have 6 months to find a new place. Jason promised everything would be fine. Spoiler alert, it wasn't. Diana moved in with her usual overbearing energy, which meant she started unpacking while criticizing everything at the same time. She walked through the house, pointing out every little detail she didn't like. She barely had her suitcases unpacked before deciding the kitchen needed, as she put it, a woman's touch. A week later, I came home from work to find that she had repainted the cabinets a color I absolutely hated, without even asking me. When I confronted her about it, she brushed it off, saying, "Oh, you'll love it once you get used to it." That was only the beginning. Diana started hosting dinner parties for her friends, turning our living room into her personal social hub. She rearranged the furniture to open up the space and even moved my grandmother's antique armchair, a cherished family heirloom, to the basement. When I asked why she had done that, she dismissed me, saying it didn't match her aesthetic. Jason, of course, told me to let it go, insisting, "It's not worth fighting over. She's just trying to feel at home." But it wasn't her home, it was mine. The final straw came one night when I overheard Diana talking to Jason in the kitchen. She was telling him that the house should be their home and that it was unfair I had sole ownership. She even suggested rethinking the deed to include Jason's name. When I confronted Jason about this, he waved it off, saying it was a misunderstanding and that Diana didn't mean it that way. But I wasn't so sure. Diana, however, stopped pretending. She started openly referring to the house as our home when speaking to Jason or her friends. One day, she even told a neighbor that I was just a guest. The neighbor later mentioned this to me, saying, "I didn't realize you were renting the place." I was furious. When Diana wasn't busy trying to claim ownership, she was gaslighting me. Anytime I pushed back against her behavior, she'd accuse me of being selfish or claim I wasn't being a team player. She began pressuring me to add Jason to the deed, arguing that a husband deserves to share the home. Every time I said no, she found another way to manipulate the situation. She'd often make snide remarks, implying I didn't trust my own husband. Jason, as usual, avoided taking sides. He'd tell me he didn't care about being on the deed, but suggested I consider it, just to keep the peace. The tension grew worse when Diana began enforcing her own house rules, as if she owned the place. She decided when the thermostat could be adjusted and what time lights should be turned off at night. She even threw away some of my personal belongings, claiming they were cluttering the space. Every time I tried to establish boundaries, she'd find a way to bulldoze through them. The breaking point came during yet another late-night whisper session between Diana and Jason. This time, I couldn't stay silent. I walked into the kitchen, ready to confront them, But before I could even say a word, Diana turned to me and said, "You're the one who doesn't belong here." That's when I knew everything was about to change. The moment Diana told me I didn't belong in my own home, I realized things were about to escalate, and they did. At first, it was subtle, as though she wanted to test how far she could push me. Whenever family came over for dinner, she'd introduce me as the guest, smiling sweetly as if it were a harmless joke. I tried to laugh it off the first time, but when it happened repeatedly, it became clear this was no joke. At one of these gatherings, Diana's sister commented on how kind it was of Diana to open her home to Jason and me. I corrected her, explaining that the house was mine. But Diana interjected with a laugh, saying, "Oh, we all know how much Jason has invested in making this place a home." My jaw tightened, but Jason just sat there staring at his plate, saying nothing. Later, when I asked him why he stayed silent, he shrugged and said, "It's not worth the fight." Things only got stranger. One evening, I came home from work to find the lock on the master bedroom door had been changed. I couldn't believe it. Diana had hired a locksmith without my permission. She claimed it was a safety precaution for Jason and me to protect our privacy, yet she kept a key for herself. I had to hire another locksmith the very next day to change it back. That was the final straw. I decided to consult a lawyer to ensure my ownership of the house was legally secure. Thankfully, it was. The lawyer also advised me to keep detailed records of everything Diana did, just in case. From that day on, I began documenting every boundary she crossed, every bizarre incident, and every unsettling interaction. Diana didn't know I was keeping track, but she made it easy. I once caught her snooping through my personal documents in my home office, with papers scattered across the desk. When I confronted her, she claimed she was organizing, but looked far too interested in my bank statements. After that, I started locking the office door. She complained I was being paranoid. The atmosphere in the house became unbearable. Diana started calling the house a prison and blamed me for it. She even told Jason she didn't understand how he could live in such conditions. Jason began spending more time away from home to avoid the constant conflict. I felt like I was living with a hostile roommate who wanted to overthrow me. A friend advised me to stand my ground and document everything. She even lent me a few books on setting boundaries. But no matter how firm I tried to be, those boundaries only seemed to provoke Diana further. She started enforcing her own set of house rules, complete with quiet hours after 9 p.m. and limits on how often I could invite friends over. Whenever I pushed back, she would frame herself as a victim, claiming she just wanted peace in her own home. The worst was her so-called cleaning spree. She'd rummage through my belongings and throw out anything she deemed unnecessary. I lost personal items, some of which had sentimental value, and her excuse was always the same. I was just tidying up. "You'll thank me later." Jason, of course, stayed neutral, insisting he didn't want to take sides. Then came the neighborhood gossip. Diana began spreading rumors, telling anyone who would listen that I had somehow stolen the house from Jason. She spun this outrageous tale about how he deserved half of it. One neighbor even approached me at the grocery store, asking if everything was okay because Diana had been talking about the situation. The final straw came when Diana invited a real estate agent to the house without telling me. I came home to find them walking through the living room, discussing potential upgrades. When I asked what was going on, Diana casually mentioned that she was exploring options just in case we decide to sell. I was stunned. That night, I confronted Jason. I asked him outright where his loyalties were. He admitted he felt conflicted, saying he wanted to make everyone happy but didn't know how. That was the moment I realized I was on my own. If I wanted to reclaim my home and my peace of mind, I'd have to take matters into my own hands. The next day, I had a heated argument with Diana. I accused her of trying to undermine my authority in my own home. She didn't even deny it. Instead, she leaned in and delivered her final blow. "If you don't like it, maybe you should leave." That's when everything clicked. This wasn't just about a controlling sister-in-law or a passive husband. This was a takeover. If Diana thought she could bully me out of my own home, she was in for a rude awakening. I decided then and there that the situation couldn't continue. It was time to take control, and I had a plan. After Diana's audacious claim that I should leave my own house, they acted as if I didn't exist, communicating exclusively with each other and ignoring me entirely. It was surreal. At that point, I knew I had to act quickly. I met with a real estate agent in secret and explained my situation. The agent was understanding and assured me she could find a buyer quickly. Within days, she came back with an all-cash offer that was too good to refuse. The thought of selling the house broke my heart. It had been my grandmother's, after all, but I knew it was the only way to reclaim control of my life. I began packing my belongings quietly, one room at a time, ensuring that neither Diana nor Jason would notice. Every box I taped shut felt like a small victory. When I looked at the cash offer again, it wasn't just a number, it was my freedom. The paperwork was finalized, and the sale was set to close. All that remained was breaking the news to Jason and Diana. I rehearsed what I was going to say, fully aware that this revelation would change everything. This wasn't just about selling the house. It was about reclaiming my life. I finalized the sale of the house without saying a word to Jason or Diana. Every detail had been carefully planned, and the paperwork was officially signed. The new owners were scheduled for a walkthrough in just a few days. My next priority was finding a new place to live. I secured a cozy one-bedroom apartment in a lovely neighborhood, far enough away to give me the fresh start I so desperately needed. Packing was a delicate operation. I wanted to ensure everything was ready without raising any suspicions. I worked at odd hours, making sure Jason and Diana wouldn't notice. To avoid suspicion, I rented a small storage unit and gradually moved boxes there so no pile would accumulate in plain sight. Each time I loaded my car with another batch of belongings, it felt like I was one step closer to reclaiming my life. The day of the walkthrough arrived faster than I anticipated. Diana was in the kitchen, loudly chatting on the phone, when the new owners rang the doorbell. I greeted them and began showing them around as if it were the most normal thing in the world. Mid-conversation, Diana wandered into the living room with her coffee cup in hand. She froze when she saw strangers standing there, asking questions about the house. "What's going on here?" she demanded, her voice sharp. I calmly explained that I had sold the house and that the new owners were here for a final walkthrough before closing. The color drained from her face as she sputtered something about it being impossible. Jason walked in at that moment, confusion etched on his face. When he realized what was happening, his confusion turned to anger. He pulled me aside, demanding an explanation. I told him the truth. The house was mine, and I had every right to sell it. I explained that I was done with the chaos. Jason exploded, accusing me of betrayal and selfishness, saying I had blindsided him and ruined everything. Meanwhile, Diana was pacing the living room, alternating between yelling at me and pleading with the new owners to reconsider. They politely ignored her and continued their walkthrough. After the buyers left, Jason demanded to know where we were supposed to go. I reminded him that the house had always been mine, and that they had been living there out of my generosity. Diana's entitlement had crossed too many lines, and I was no longer willing to tolerate it. Jason stood there in disbelief, while Diana stormed out, slamming the door behind her. The reality of the situation hit them both hard. Over the next few days, Diana tried to rally support from extended family, but her reputation preceded her. Years of burning bridges and manipulating people had left her with no one willing to take her in. Jason, for all his anger, seemed to understand there was nothing he could do. He spent his days calling friends, desperately looking for somewhere to stay. The neighbors quickly caught wind of the drama. Diana had spent months telling people that the house was hers, but the truth spread like wildfire. One neighbor even stopped me while I was loading my car, shaking her head and saying, I don't know how you put up with her for so long. Apparently, Diana had been bad-mouthing me for months, and people were finally seeing through her lies. Jason eventually found a friend who let him crash on their couch. However, he begged me to let him and Diana move into my new apartment. He argued that I was abandoning him and leaving his sister homeless. I told Jason firmly that I needed space and independence, and that neither he nor Diana was welcome in my new life. He left the conversation furious, but powerless. A few days after I moved into my apartment, Diana showed up at the building. She pounded on my door, demanding to be let in. I refused to open it. She screamed outside for what felt like an eternity, drawing the attention of neighbors, before finally leaving. I immediately called my lawyer, who advised me to file for a restraining order if Diana tried to harass me again. Jason's choice became clear after that. He moved in with his friend and left Diana to fend for herself. She ended up in a cheap motel, calling family members and begging for help. Word got back to me through mutual acquaintances that she was blaming me for everything, but no one was buying her story anymore. Her downfall was entirely of her own making. For the first time in what felt like forever, I began to enjoy peace in my new space. The silence was refreshing, and the absence of constant tension was a relief. I focused on work, reconnected with friends, and started decorating my apartment, a space that finally felt like mine. One night, as I sat on my balcony sipping coffee, I received a message from Jason. He apologized for everything, saying he wanted a second chance and promising that he would change. I stared at the message for a long time, contemplating what to do. Not long after Jason's message asking for a second chance, he launched what I can only describe as an apology tour. He called me repeatedly, left voicemails, and even showed up at my apartment building. Eventually, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop neutral ground. Jason claimed that he had cut ties with Diana for good and that he wanted to work on our marriage. He said he understood his mistakes and wanted to start fresh. But something about his story didn't sit right with me. For someone who supposedly severed ties, he still seemed far too defensive about Diana. He brushed off her behavior as a result of stress and bad circumstances, insisting that she just needed help. I told him I needed real proof of the supposed clean break before I could even consider hearing him out. Meanwhile, Diana wasn't lying low. She began spreading lies about me to extended family. Through mutual acquaintances, I discovered she was claiming I had stolen the house from Jason, manipulated him, and left them both homeless out of spite. A few relatives even reached out to confront me, parroting her accusations. Luckily, I was prepared. I sent them evidence, including camera footage, bank statements, and a detailed timeline of events. It didn't take long for most of them to realize that Diana's version of the story didn't hold water. But Diana wasn't done. She decided to escalate things by filing a frivolous lawsuit against me for emotional damages. Receiving the paperwork in the mail caught me off guard, but my lawyer quickly assured me the case was baseless. We filed a response, and the court dismissed her claim almost immediately. Still, it was another exhausting hurdle in a saga that seemed never-ending. Jason's true colors emerged not long after. Despite his earlier promises of cutting ties, he admitted during another conversation that he missed his sister and wanted to reconcile with her. He framed it as being caught between two people he cared about, but to me it was clear he would never choose me over her. That realization was all I needed to make my final decision. I told Jason that our marriage was over. I couldn't keep fighting a battle where my partner wasn't even on my side. He didn't argue. He just sat there quietly, almost as if he had been expecting it. I filed for divorce the next day, officially closing the chapter on Jason and Diana for good, or so I thought. Diana's life took a steep decline after that. With no family willing to take her in and no steady source of income, she eventually ended up in a shelter. A mutual acquaintance told me that Diana was still blaming me for her situation, but I didn't care anymore. I had cut off all communication with both her and Jason and was fully focused on moving forward. To truly start fresh, I decided to move to a new city. I found an amazing job opportunity in a vibrant area, packed up what little I had left, and began the next chapter of my life. The move felt cathartic. I left behind the ghosts of my old life and embraced the freedom of starting over. But Diana wasn't done. A few weeks after my move, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. It was from Diana. In it, she blamed me for everything: her homelessness, her strained family relationships, even Jason's struggles. Page after page, she ranted about how I had ruined her life and destroyed her brother's happiness. I didn't even finish reading it. I shredded the letter and tossed it in the trash. That was the last time I let her words occupy any space in my life. Surprisingly, support came from an unexpected place: my old neighborhood. A few neighbors reached out after hearing about the drama, expressing their sympathy and even admiration for how I had handled the situation. One neighbor mentioned they had always suspected Diana wasn't as innocent as she pretended to be. Their kind words reminded me that not everyone believed the lies she had spread. Jason tried to reconnect a few more times. He sent texts asking to meet up, saying he missed me and still loved me. I ignored every message and eventually blocked him. There was no point in reopening old wounds. My life was better without the chaos he and Diana brought with them. Now, I'm in a place where I've truly moved on. My new job is going well, and I've made some wonderful friends in my new city. I've learned the value of setting boundaries and standing up for myself, even when it's uncomfortable. Most importantly, I've found peace, a kind of peace I didn't think was possible during the height of all the drama. Looking back, it's hard to believe how much has changed. What started as a nightmare turned into an opportunity to rebuild my life from the ground up. I'm finally free of the toxic influence of Diana and Jason, and I couldn't be more grateful for the fresh start. As for Jason and Diana, well, their fate is no longer my concern. A few months after I had settled into my new city, Diana reappeared in the most modern way possible, through a Facebook smear campaign. She created a public group titled something like "Exposing My Name." The woman who destroyed our lives. Mutual acquaintances tipped me off about the page, which was filled with wild, fabricated stories about how I had forced her and Jason out of their home and stolen everything they owned. Diana spared no detail in painting herself as a victim, twisting events to make me look like the villain. They had abandoned them, leaving them homeless. I chose not to engage with the group. Instead, I let her own lies work against her. It didn't take long for the comment section to explode, with people calling her out. Neighbors from my old community, extended family members, and even some of Jason's friends began sharing their experiences with Diana's manipulative behavior. One person shared a story about how Diana had tried to guilt-trip them into lending her money years ago. Another neighbor revealed how Diana had claimed the house was hers, even though everyone knew it wasn't true. Her attempts to gain sympathy backfired spectacularly. While Diana spiraled online, Jason's life wasn't faring much better. I heard through mutual acquaintances that even his closest friends were distancing themselves from him. They didn't want to be dragged into his sister's drama, and many of them were tired of how he always seemed to take her side. Jason was becoming increasingly isolated, and Diana's growing desperation only made things worse. In a final desperate attempt, Diana actually contacted the new homeowners of my old house. She claimed she had been wrongfully evicted and asked if they could help her. They politely but firmly told her to leave them alone, then blocked her number. When I heard about this, I couldn't help but laugh at her audacity. But Diana wasn't done causing trouble. One morning at work, I was in the middle of a meeting when the receptionist called to tell me someone was asking for me in the lobby. When I went down there, she was Diana, standing there like she owned the place. She launched into a tirade, accusing me of ruining her life and demanding that I fix the mess I had caused. Security quickly intervened and escorted her out, but the scene she created was humiliating. I filed a formal complaint with my workplace and decided it was time to take legal action. That afternoon, I called my lawyer and began the process of filing a restraining order against Diana. The paperwork was straightforward, and the evidence I had, from her Facebook post to her workplace outburst, made my case strong. Once the order was in place, Diana was legally barred from contacting me or coming near my new apartment or workplace. As if things couldn't get worse for them, I later learned that Jason had lost his job. He had been struggling to hold it together for months, and the stress of his situation finally caught up with him. With no income and no friends willing to take him in, he moved back in with Diana at the cheap motel where she had been staying. Diana then tried to gain sympathy by spreading news of a minor health scare. She claimed the stress I caused had led to her condition, but nobody believed it. Extended family and acquaintances were tired of her antics and mostly ignored her attempts to play the victim. Her next move was almost laughable. Diana set up a crowdfunding campaign with a long, dramatic post about how she and Jason had been wrongfully displaced and needed help to get back on their feet. The campaign barely gained any traction. In fact, the comments section filled up with people exposing her lies and recounting her history of manipulative behavior. The campaign was quietly taken down a week later. While Diana and Jason floundered, my life continued to improve. I got a promotion at work, which not only came with a pay raise, but also new responsibilities that I genuinely enjoyed. I focused on building new friendships and decorating my apartment, which now felt like a true sanctuary. Jason, however, wasn't ready to give up. One evening, he showed up at my apartment building, begging for reconciliation. He pleaded with me to give him another chance, insisting he had changed. I stayed calm and reminded him that our divorce was final. I told him I had no intention of reopening that chapter of my life. He left, looking defeated, and I blocked him from all contact. Shortly after, Diana's last move came in the form of a letter sent through a mutual acquaintance. In it, she promised to leave me alone forever if I provided her with financial help. I didn't even bother to respond. The letter went straight into the shredder. Not long after, I heard through the grapevine that Diana and Jason had been evicted from their motel for non-payment. With no family left willing to help them, their options were running out. I didn't ask for more details. I was done keeping tabs on their lives. One evening, as I sat on my balcony sipping coffee, I realized I felt nothing but relief. For the first time in years, there was no drama, no chaos, and no toxic people trying to drag me down. I was free to focus on my career, my friendships, and the bright future ahead of me. The chapter with Diana and Jason was closed for good,